About 70 years ago, two Bedouin shepherds accidentally explored a narrow cave in the West Bank and made an incredible discovery. Inside stone jars, they didn't find gold, silver, or precious stones, but 7 scrolls of text that revolutionized our understanding of ancient Judaism and the origins of Christianity. These scrolls, along with others found later in the same region, are now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. In this video, we will explore what exactly these documents are, their content, who wrote them, and why they are considered one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of handwritten texts that remained forgotten for nearly 2,000 years in the caves of Qumran. Qumran is an ancient ruin located on the western shore of the Dead Sea, hence the name Dead Sea Scrolls. The first scrolls were found by Bedouin shepherds around 1947, stored in stone jars inside the famous Cave 1. After the discovery of these scrolls, further searches and excavations revealed several other caves with similar materials. To date, 12 caves have been identified, and excavations continue in search of more fascinating finds. So what exactly do these texts say? Initially, deciphering them was challenging due to the deteriorated state of most of the manuscripts after centuries of exposure to the elements. In total, over 15,000 fragments were recovered, some as small as a fingernail. After meticulous work, experts recognized that these fragments formed about 900 distinct scrolls. These scrolls were primarily made of parchment, a writing material made from animal skin, typically from sheep. Additionally, some scrolls were made of papyrus, a plant-based material used to produce paper. The application of the carbon-14 dating method, which analyzes biological materials, revealed that most of the scrolls date back to the 1st century BCE. Other dating methods, such as paleography, which studies the form and handwriting style of the text, and historical dating, based on known events, place most of the Dead Sea Scrolls in this period. However, some texts may be even older, dating back to the late 3rd century BCE, or more recent, from the mid-1st century CE. As for the languages, the texts are predominantly in Hebrew, but there are also texts in Aramaic, Greek, and even in cryptic scripts, which have been deciphered after extensive research by scholars. But the question remains, what exactly is the content of these texts? When it comes to content, the Dead Sea Scrolls can be basically divided into 2 groups, biblical and non-biblical writings. This division is made for organizational purposes only, as it's important to note that the ancient owners of these texts didn't make this distinction. Talking about a Bible of the Dead Sea Scrolls is somewhat forced because they didn't organize these texts into a single volume like we do today. They were simply various scrolls, often accompanied by other texts, as we will see shortly. With that said, what we generally call biblical writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls are the texts that we now know as part of the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament and Jews call the Tanakh. All the books of the Hebrew Bible are present among the Dead Sea Scrolls, except for the Book of Esther. This fact alone would be enough to consider this discovery as one of, if not the most, important archaeological discoveries of the last few centuries. Before this, the oldest Hebrew copies of the Bible we had dated back to the Middle Ages, much closer to us today than to the original times when these texts were written. But now, thanks to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which, as I mentioned, date approximately to the 1st century BCE, we can delve more than 1,000 years deeper into history and assess how much the texts of the Bible have changed over time. We won't delve into the specifics of textual comparisons here, but it's important to highlight that most of the biblical texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls are very similar to the medieval copies on which modern editions of the Bible are based. For example, if we compare the book of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the current version, the differences are minimal. usually involving grammatical variations or different spellings of the same word, which do not affect the understanding of the text. However, there are rarer cases of significant variations, such as in the Masoretic text of Deuteronomy, where the medieval Hebrew versions say "sons of Israel," while the Dead Sea Scrolls say "sons of God," an expression often used to refer to celestial beings. This alteration can significantly change the meaning of the passage. Besides these variations, there are also cases of additions or reductions in the books when compared with more recent versions found in the Qumran manuscripts. For instance, a book of Jeremiah was found with a considerably shorter and modified text. Several psalms that are not present in any medieval or modern Bible were also discovered. Additionally, as mentioned before, there are various books in the Qumran caves that are not part of most current Bibles. Some examples are the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Book of Enoch, and the Book of Jubilees. In fact, the collection of texts we are calling biblical writings here represents only a small part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The majority are non-biblical writings, which include apocryphal books like the Book of Enoch, and also a series of sectarian writings. These texts describe the origins, worldview, and lifestyle rules of a very peculiar community, possibly the original owners of the library found on the shores of the Dead Sea. It is suspected that this community was the famous and mysterious Essenes. Before the discoveries at Qumran, the Essenes were already well known in history thanks to written sources. For example, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in the 1st century AD, divided Judaism of his time into 3 main branches: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, who sought a more stringent discipline. Another 1st century author, Philo of Alexandria, also mentioned the Essenes as models of purity and discipline. Even the Roman author Pliny the Elder dedicated a few words to this group in his magnum opus, Natural History. With all these references, it is possible to create a profile of the Essenes and compare it with the Qumran community described in the sectarian writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. One thing that is certain is that this community followed strict rules of ritual purification, communal living, and worship in comparison with other Jewish branches. They truly sought a more rigorous discipline. To illustrate this, we can apply the words used by Josephus to describe the Essenes. There are several specific parallels in this comparison. First, according to Josephus, those who joined the Essenes transferred their property to the order. This practice is also found in the rules of the Qumran community. Another point is that Josephus mentions a candidate for the Essenes was observed for a year before being accepted into the community, followed by a 2-year probationary period. The sectarian writings from Qumran also stipulate a 1-year observation period before accepting a new member, followed by a 1-year probationary period. So while there's a difference here, there's also a significant parallel. Additionally, Josephus highlights the radical belief of the Essenes that everything was predetermined, a deep faith in divine providence and God's already established and unchangeable plan for history. This aligns well with the doctrine of predestination found in the Qumran community rule writings. Lastly, a particularly peculiar parallel is that Josephus mentions the Essenes avoided spitting in the middle of the group, or to the right side. Surprisingly, the sectarian writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls also address this point, stipulating that anyone who spits during a general assembly of members would be punished. Beyond these doctrinal clues, there is also an important geographical clue found in Pliny, the Elder's Natural History, which mentions that the Essenes lived without women, sex, or money on the shores of the Dead Sea, south of Jericho, and north of Engedi and Masada. The location where the manuscripts were discovered fits perfectly, suggesting that the Qumran community were the Essenes, right? Well, not exactly. While there is a lot of evidence supporting this idea, there are also some significant problems considered by historians and archaeologists today. For example, Pliny's reference to the Essenes living without women doesn't align with what we find in the sectarian writings. Women were present in the Qumran community. Josephus also mentions that the Essenes were generally celibate, But this wasn't the case for the Qumran community. Even Josephus notes that some Essenes were not celibate. Another discrepancy is that both Philo of Alexandria and Josephus state that the Essenes rejected slavery. But in the sectarian writings we find rules about how to treat slaves, indicating a different practice. Additionally, there are several other notable characteristics of the Dead Sea Scrolls community that are not mentioned in any of the writings about the Essenes. For example, the Qumran community followed a solar calendar instead of the more traditional lunisolar calendar in Judaism. This was controversial in ancient Judaism due to its implications for observing festivals and religious dates, and it also affected the functioning of the Jerusalem temple. Another significant point is the emphasis on their highest leader, called the Teacher of Righteousness, a figure not mentioned in sources about the Essenes. The Qumran documents never use the term Essene or anything similar. They refer to themselves as Yahad, which means unity in Hebrew. Despite these issues, the positive evidence linking the Essenes to the Qumran community remains strong. Many scholars still argue that there is some connection between the Essenes and the community that produced or maintained the Dead Sea Scrolls. They might not have been exactly the same group, but they shared a close common root. So, perhaps the Qumran community was a specific group within the broader Essene movement. However, there are also other very different theories being considered. Some historians suggest that the Dead Sea Scrolls do not represent just the library of a single group. What some highly respected experts in this field argue is that the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually a collection of books hidden by Jews from various sects over a more extended period, coinciding with the Jewish-Roman Wars. There is a lot of evidence that supports this idea. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by many different people, as we can deduce from analyzing the handwriting of each scroll. If these texts had been produced by a small local community, we would expect only a few scribes working on them, maybe 2 or 3, at most 10. However, paleographic analysis reveals that hundreds of different individuals contributed to the production of these texts. This suggests very diverse origins. Another interesting detail is the treasure maps found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are actually lists of objects hidden to prevent them from being looted by the Romans during the war. These maps detail what objects were hidden and where they were hidden, with the hope that they could be recovered after the conflict ended. However, due to the overwhelming victory of the Romans, these objects likely remained buried to this day. No one managed to return to retrieve the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they stayed hidden for over 2,000 years until Bedouin shepherds from the region brought them back to light. So there are still many uncertainties in this story, but what is clear is that, regardless of the precise details, the discovery at Qumran has already provided a wealth of valuable information to better understand the context of ancient Judaism and the origins of Christianity. Practices like baptism and communal meals, such as the communal supper, were practiced by the Qumran community. They also strongly emphasized separation from the world, a theme we see a lot in Christianity. Additionally, they had an intense messianic hope and wrote extensively about the expectation of a final battle between the forces of good and evil, something similar to the Christian apocalypse, especially in the book of Revelation. For a future video, we can delve deeper into the theology of the Dead Sea Scrolls and make comparisons with Christianity. But for this introductory video about what the Dead Sea Scrolls essentially are, I think we've covered a lot. In summary, the Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of Jewish texts, primarily from the 1st century BCE, but also a bit earlier and later. They contain the oldest biblical texts ever found, as well as a series of other religious books that are crucial to understanding Jewish beliefs of that time and the practices of some Jewish groups. Of course, there is much more to explore about this material. So, leave comments on what other details you would like to see in future videos here on the channel about the Dead Sea Scrolls and this general context. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video.